Welcome to another fantastic IDE seminar. We have a great speaker and a great piece of research today, which I'm personally very excited about. So Bo Cowgill is a professor at Columbia Business School. He has done some of the most groundbreaking research in our sort of WISE economics of information systems community over the years, won several awards in that community. He's also won the Aspen Institute 2019 Ideas Worth Teaching Award for his class on people analytics and strategy. He's a top 40 under 40 business school professor, just a fantastic researcher and an important voice in our community. I loved reading the abstract for today's talk, which, and the paper as well, is just amazing. It's all about where does algorithmic bias come from, right? So we have all of these questions about, okay, we think algorithms are biased. Is it because the way they're coded? Is it because of the data? Is it because, you know, the people who are coding them are instilling their own personal biases in the algorithms themselves, and so on? And so Bo and his colleagues have done this fantastic, very large scale experiment where they randomized each of those top explanations for where algorithmic bias comes from. So we're going to take questions in the chat throughout, and I'll moderate a discussion about them at the end. And if you have a clarifying question that pops up in the chat, I might interrupt Bo with that during the time. So with that, Bo, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Sinan, thank you so much for that introduction. So our talk today is about something that I'm sure you've seen in the headlines, if nothing else, over the last couple of years. And given that this is a sort of a digital economy seminar, you know, you've probably seen headlines like these about the ethical or sort of disparate impact of digital systems. This is an article about algorithms given to judges, trying to advise them about how much or little they should give someone for bail in criminal court. There was also some news about Amazon, which, you know, purportedly had a resume screening algorithm that was biased against women. And then, of course, there are some people, you know, who have a bit of more optimistic perspective and think that AI and related technologies can actually, you know, help, for example, startup investors diversify their, you know, their portfolio and their deal pipeline. Now, this has become such a kind of important topic that lots of new research has sprung up to try to address this and study it. But most of this research is appearing in computer science theory outlets. And what we thought was missing, and part of the big motivation behind the project today, was the lack of empirical papers about the AI development process and how these are linked to biased outcomes in code. So of course, most code in production is not written by CS theorists. It's written by everyday programmers who may not have a deep background in CS theory and who are subject to organizational pressures like culture, incentives, training, and, you know, other things that don't typically appear in computer science theory. So what would it mean to take this behavioral or empirical perspective? We need clean, you know, experimental or random variation in programming practices, you know, clear metrics of success and failure, and then, you know, we could causally link these different aspects back to the presence or absence of bias and try to connect this back to theory so that there's a dialogue, you know, between theory and empirics. So, like I said, this would be an empirical or behavioral or organizational perspective on algorithmic production, and particularly algorithmic bias. And it would help answer questions about, you know, why does algorithmic bias arise in the first place, and what are practical interventions, you know, what practical interventions are possible to try to decrease it. All right, so that's the goal of this paper. Now let me tell you about what we do. We have about 8.2 million algorithmic predictions of math skill by around 400 AI engineers. And I'll tell you all the details of this after after I introduce the general setup. All of our engineers have been randomly assigned to an experimental condition, and the random assignments affect their incentives, their training data, their technical knowledge of AI ethics, and their sort of general awareness. And after they develop these algorithms, we're able to test them in a variety of ways to try to measure the presence of bias. In particular, we look at their out-of-sample predictions. They have to make 20,000 of them. And for the 20,000 out-of-sample predictions, we can look at the ground truth math performance. This is what they're actually trying to predict, which we held out for them, as part of their training assignment. And we can also look at randomized manipulations of algorithmic inputs. So you can think of these manipulations of inputs as being like a digital equivalent of a resume audit. So instead of sending out randomized resumes to employers that only alter one aspect of the resume, you can send an observation of a person, in data to our subjects' algorithms, randomly manipulating, for example, their gender or other characteristics, and see how the algorithm assesses them differently. So this is how we will, assess the outcomes of the experiment. And so, the goal of this is to try to attribute the creation of biased code back to personnel or management or behavioral issues in machine learning engineers. So things like incentives or attention or training and et cetera, but also back to worker characteristics. So, the title of this paper is Biased Data or Biased Programmers. One very common proposed solution is to, for biased algorithms, is to diversify the workforce. So we'll be able to shed some light on that by looking at the relationship between worker characteristics in our sample and our outcomes regarding how the bias or not that appears in their code and subsequent predictions. As we as we go through this analysis and I show you the results, we're going to be focusing on accuracy as our main metric for the presence of bias. And we have some other ones as well, but we're mainly looking at overall accuracy broken down by different groups in the sample, or the sample that they're trying to predict about, the math students, that is. And also the direction of the bias in terms of, were the programmers in our sample over-predicting math ability or under-predicting math ability? So here's why we focus on accuracy. Obviously not, most people, for example, doing hiring, don't only care about, how well someone performs at math, which is the topic we're studying. But even if a decision maker has an additional objectives, they might, for example, have an explicit preference for diversity. If they have an unbiased prediction of ability on math, then they can be on the efficient frontier between maximizing math performance of the workers that they hire and whatever their kind of other objectives are, whether it's diversity or other skills other than math, things like that. So this is how our measures of algorithmic bias would fit into other measures and other types of objectives. Okay. Now, with this out of the way, let me give you a preview of results before we go into kind of the main content and the main kind of empirical details and description of what exactly we did. Our first result is about the effect of bias training data. So reducing bias in the training data, out of everything we saw, had the biggest effect on performance in the reduction of bias. But surprisingly, about 1/3 of this benefit comes from a novel reason that I think social scientists and economists will be more familiar with, but computer scientists don't typically talk very much about, and that reason is effort. What we find is that our AI engineers in the unbiased training data condition supply about 31% more hours of effort. They end up working harder on the problem or working for longer hours. And what this suggests that I'll talk about later is a complementarity between data and effort. So it's more worthwhile for a programmer to spend time coding the algorithm or developing it or improving it if they have the confidence that they're working with high quality data. And as a sub-treatment, we investigate whether or not stronger incentives are also complementary with better data. And our experiment kind of validates this intuition as well, which is that incentives are especially effective at reducing algorithmic bias in the presence of high quality training data. And the intuition is you're more likely to win more incentives if you work harder, and you could get more benefit out of your effort, if you have high quality training data to try to extract a predictive capacity out of this data. Okay, our second main result moves on from our questions about training data now to programmer characteristics. And we find just very little evidence that minority or less biased programmers write more socially aware code. And so it's hopefully somewhat clear what we mean by minority. We have the demographic measures for our 400 AI engineers. But in addition, we've given them an implicit association test at the end of their task, so we can kind of measure how subconsciously biased they are, or at least have one measure of this. We actually find out that this is not really correlated with any of our outcome measures in the programs they write either. This is true for the prediction bias or the accuracy metrics I talked about earlier. It's also true for whether or not these programmers are willing to directly use like gender variables or race variables in the code that they write. Now, so this is a somewhat negative result about about programmer types, but there is one exception to it, which is we find that prediction errors are actually correlated within demographic groups. And so if you're able to average signals across a diverse group of programmers, then you end up getting more uncorrelated signals and ultimately higher accuracy from the average signal or the average prediction than if you didn't do any averaging, or if you averaged within one demographic group. So I'll elaborate on this a little bit more later on. But what the results suggest is that the benefit of diversity isn't that the new underrepresented group actually does better. It's that they have uncorrelated signals that combine to produce a final output that's higher quality. All right, now our third main result is about practical interventions that managers can use to decrease algorithmic bias. What we find is that simple reminders about algorithmic bias are almost half as effective as fully unbiasing the data. We'll unpack that a little bit. There are some caveats worth knowing about this. But the simple reminders, I think, were surprisingly effective, especially in contrast to our technical advice conditions. We also gave all of our subjects, a random subset of our subjects, some jargon-free, machine learning advice about how to reduce sample selection bias. And on average, this made things worse. The people who were able to successfully implement it actually did decrease their bias in their programming. But it looks like most of our subjects in this condition didn't correctly implement the technical advice. And so, if there's difficulty actually implementing it, this kind of puts a ceiling on how effective this sort of intervention would be. And I'll talk more about this in that section of the talk. So this is related to several strands of literature about algorithmic discrimination as a whole, but also especially about the use of algorithms for human capital. It's also related to new methods for conducting audit studies or measures of discrimination. And then finally, of course, it's related to statistical discrimination, and especially inaccurate statistical discrimination, which is a kind of a topic that there's been much more research about in the past 5 or 10 years or so. So why don't I pause here and just make sure, Sinal, I don't know if there was any urgent questions that come up. I'm going to look at the chat real quick.
So I've been looking at them, and a couple of things about how do you know whether the data that you're giving is good, or whether the technical advice that you're giving is good? You know, this is typically true of experiments where we intervene and we're wondering whether a broad class of intervention works or not. And then the question is, did your intervention measure up to, you know, representing well the best class intervention in that category, be it good data versus bad data, or good training versus bad training, good technical advice versus bad technical advice, and so
on. Thanks, Sinan. So I'll share more about this in the next couple of slides. Yeah, it's probably easiest to answer that question just you know, by going through what we did, and we can talk about it then. You know, our co-authors here, you know, most of them are in the computer science. I should have said in the beginning, actually, you know, one of our co-authors, Fabrizio Dell'Acqua, is I think on this call and can also help answer questions. You know, if you have any reactions, Fabrizio. But we relied on our computer science co-authors in those cases to help, you know, guide what the technical advice should be. And you know, I'll talk a little bit more about that in that section of the experiment. Anything else?
Perfect. I think that that pretty much covers the clarifying question sort of category.
Okay, awesome. All right, so now I'll just dig a little bit more into exactly how we set this experiment up, and you know, the different hypotheses that we're addressing. Okay? So we're asking programmers in this case to measure or to predict math skill. As training data, we've given our programmers administrative data from the OECD. This is, you know, the data they got. It's called the PIAC data set. It's basically the canonical data set for cross-country comparisons of math literacy. And the OECD has essentially sent people into the field and given them a math test. It's a relatively short, you know, 10 to 20 question math test. And it has been very carefully assembled by the OECD statisticians for representativeness of each OECD country's population as a whole. And so, you know, it's obviously very hard to get high quality data about performance on any task generally for, you know, a large representative group of people, as opposed to, you know, a selected group that's been assigned to, you know, to take a test or do some task for some other reason. So this is really great data, I think, in general, but especially for our task. It does have one problem, which is that the data about ethnicity is inconsistent from country to country because of different notions of ethnicity and race. And so we're going to be mainly focusing on gender disparities for that reason. Okay. So this OECD test is the kind of test that an employer might use to screen workers. There's individual level you know, observations in this data set. And there are over 5,000 covariates per person about their background, what they were doing in their previous job. And we let our AI engineers use whatever approach they want to assess these, to use these different data sets or these different variables in order to do their predictions. So I've already alluded to the fact that one of our interventions was to manipulate this training data experimentally. Let me tell you a little bit about this. So some of our subjects were randomly assigned a perfectly representative training sample from this PIAC data set. So they were asked to make out of sample predictions about a perfectly representative sample. And, you know, the ones who were in the the first condition on the slide also got a randomly selected sample of training data. There's a perfect match between what they're training on and what they're predicting. But the other conditions received realistic sample selection bias. And so why did we give some of our subjects realistic sample selection bias? Well, that is the problem that lots of companies face when they're trying to develop their own hiring algorithms. In other words, they have performance data, but they only have performance data for people who they're already likely to hire. And they might want to develop an algorithm to screen all applicants or all potential candidates. So I wanted to flag this while we're talking about the training data, and I'll describe more experimental conditions shortly. Okay? So why are we studying math? It's an important skill for lots of high-wage careers. It's the topic of gender stereotypes. And also importantly, there are some objectively correct answers, at least relatively speaking, compared to different subjects. And that's nice because we can compare subjects' algorithms to some sort of ground truth. And we can also compare the answers on the OECD's test, to some, theoretically objective notion of, correct answers on math. So there's a little bit about the training data. Now let me tell you about the subject population. So we have about 400 engineers. We recruited them and did not tell them that they're part of a study. What we said alternatively was, we need your help to develop a resume screening algorithm. Now, about 80% of our engineers were recruited through an AI bootcamp at a large research university whose name we can't disclose. And these programmers, on average, had about 1.2 years of experience. About 31% had already worked at a major tech company in a software engineering role, and about half were coming from industry, and about half were coming directly, from an undergraduate or from a graduate program. And so this university has this boot camp. And its engineers tend to go on to work at places like Google and Facebook. So these students actually are the sorts of engineers who would go out and build code that the general public would actually use. So that's 80% of our sample. The other 20% we hired directly as freelance programmers. And they had on average about 4 years of experience. We did this to try to get some more programmers that had more job experience, somewhat contrasting to our more young and less experienced people who are coming from the boot camp. So as a whole, our subject population was a little bit more diverse than the software engineering population as a whole, at least in the US. And I'll highlight, especially given that we're focusing on gender, there were about 30% female, rather than the approximately 20% female, in the software engineering population as a whole in the United States. So here is what our direct hire recruitment looked like. This is the 20% who we hired as freelance programmers. And here's our boot camp overview, or sort of the syllabus. You can see what this looks like. Once we got these engineers, let me tell you about what they were asked to do. So everyone was required to complete, the task that I'm going to describe as an individual task, and our engineers were stratified, randomly assigned, to our 4 different experimental conditions to balance gender, ethnicity, and education across them. And our 4 treatment conditions, you can basically see them on this slide. There were the first 3 out of the 4 received the biased training data. This is the kind where it featured realistic sample selection. The first one was a control group. They got the biased training data, but they, it was not, it was described as biased training data, but there was nothing to make this fact vivid to them. And then we also gave in treatment 2 a non-technical reminder that I'll share on the next page. And in treatment 3, we gave the non-technical reminder as well as some jargon-free technical advice on sample selection corrections for machine learning. I've kind of produced the set of canonical papers about this topic here. The jargon-free technical advice gave them several different options about how to implement this. And the way we made sure this was high quality was by two things. First, we asked we got one of our computer science research assistants to implement some of these techniques and make sure that they would work well on the problem. And also, of course, we simply asked around for what are the best papers to try to deal with the sample selection problem, and spend some time developing an approachable way to explain these. And it's nothing too complicated. It mainly has to do with reweighting the sample. So here are our first three, and then our fourth experimental condition is where we give them representative training data. So they don't have the sample selection problem that we think often creates algorithmic bias. Because most companies don't have a random sample of the sort of people that their algorithm touches. They only have a sample of performance or outcome data, for the people that they have worked with in the past or something like this. Okay? So these are our four experimental conditions. And given the setting, especially with the boot camp, you might wonder, what about contamination? Where are we going to have the sort of problem where, a student in one condition talks to a student in the other condition, and they, end up affecting each other? We had several ways to deal with this, but the main one is just we told them that they were all going to get a different problem, but it was all related to building a hiring algorithm. And we changed some of the details, the superficial details of their instructions and of the problem, so that if anyone tried to compare with their neighbors, that they would see something that looked pretty different. And we had various other ways to detect cheating or contamination. And basically, it seems like our ways to suppress this contamination seems like it mostly worked. If it didn't, I should say, this would bias us towards having zero effects or zero differences between our different treatment conditions. And we do see differences. And it's possible without contamination, we might actually see higher. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the non-technical reminder next. Here's the full text of this. I won't read all of it, but you can tell it basically says, don't forget about the fact that this data comes from a potentially biased social system. There may be discrimination or self-sorting of applicants that would create inequalities in your training data. And thinking about this might kind of make your algorithm more accurate. So that will give you a sense of what's going on in the reminder condition. We also had a sub-treatment that I alluded to earlier, where we randomized the performance benchmarks. Now, everybody in the experiment, had incentives facing them. And those incentives were either their bonuses for the freelancers or the grades that were used to help place the bootcamp subjects into jobs afterwards. And the mean squared error benchmarks were tied to these payoffs. So we randomized some aspects of these benchmarks to try to get a sense of what higher or lower benchmark incentives would do to the accuracy of their code and the accuracy of their predictions. Okay. All right, now I'll tell you about the main outcome variables before going into our results. I told you already that we're focusing on gender because of the higher quality of data in the OECD there. And then we look at two main notions of algorithmic bias or unfairness. The first one, we're calling discrimination, which is the direct use of gender or demographic variables to change assessments. And our approach there is similar to the resume audit approach that I talked about earlier. And then the second notion of bias or unfairness is prediction bias. And by that, I just mean that, systematic over or underestimation of ability by gender. And this notion, this outcome metric, looks only at outcomes, irrespective of what variables are used. This it's kind of a more outcome-based, less process-based measure of whether or not, bias or some sort of discrimination occurred. So I've talked a little bit about why I focus on accuracy, so I won't go back into that anymore. It's about the efficient frontier and the trade-off between accuracy and other objectives. Okay. Now let me get into our results. And it looks like I have about 30 minutes left. So why don't I take a quick glance and see if there are any urgent burning questions. All right, I don't see any in the chat, although there's some private messages that are kind of funny. Sinan, anything I should clarify?
I think right now we were right where we were in terms of clarifying questions earlier. So you're good to go.
Okay, so you'd like to talk, I mean, now's probably a better time to talk about whether or not these are the best possible interventions. Is that right?
Perfect, yeah.
Well, I talked some about why I think that the technical advice was the best possible technical advice. We implemented it to make sure that it would work well, and we also consulted, CS professors at the bleeding edge of this field, to ask them for advice that was high quality and it was something that the programmers could actually implement. On our unbiased data intervention, I think this is the best and possibly too good of an intervention. The unbiased data that treatment arm got was a completely random sample of the outcome space that they were asked to predict. I think it's a much higher quality and more representative data set than definitely any company that I've ever seen. So I worked at Google before my PhD, and a little bit after. They would never have this high quality of data. They would have super detailed data about all of their users, but they only had data about the users who had opted in or who they had recruited, or about the workers who they had hired, and who had come to work at the company. So if anything, I think that the unbiased data might be kind of more than most companies could aspire to, although there are some strategies, and maybe at the end I'll talk about how somebody could, how a company could get realistic data. On the topic of our non-technical reminder, we did go through several drafts of this, and our kind of evaluation of this was not super scientific, but basically Columbia has this data science institute with lots of researchers from lots of disciplines working on algorithmic fairness. And we, put our draft before this group of people and said, what is an effective reminder? Not something that would, necessarily teach the person how to correct an algorithmic bias problem, because we have a separate, treatment condition for that, but would trigger them to think more carefully about what they're doing. So that was their approach for there. Admittedly, it's less scientific, I think, the other ones, but that, this is how we went about designing these different interventions. Anyway, let me know if you have any other questions. 1 second.
Thanks, Bill.
No problem. So here's what we found out, and here's how these programmers reacted to our experiment. The first thing I'll show you, because I think we probably have a lot of pretty technical people in this audience, are just a description of the engineering approaches that were used. So you may not be too surprised. Most people used Python or some variant of Python. Not necessarily the most recent version, but some flavor. However, the functional forms of the different algorithms being implemented were kind of quite varied. About 50% of people used random forest. There were about 20% of people that developed some sort of deep learning like neural net application. Around 36 had some flavor of a linear model like lasso, ridge regression. And then I'll also just point out that a third of them had some sort of ensemble approach that fit different models. Some neural nets, some random forest, and then tried to combine them together to have an average prediction across their ensemble. So that gives you a sense of what their approach was. And now I'll tell you more about the main outcomes we were looking at related to bias, prediction bias, and discrimination. So in the set of graphs above, I'm going to show you coefficient plots, and the coefficient plots will have come out of the regression equation that looks like this. We're aggregating results at the programmer level, clustering standard errors also at the programmer level, and then so that you can interpret this, our baseline is treatment condition number 1. It's the unrepresentative data with no reminder and no advice. So that's sort of what we think of as what companies would do by default, absent some sort of proactive measure to contain algorithmic bias through training, through better data, or through one of the other conditions that we've implemented. Okay? And then also, as you interpret these results, just remember that the technical advice intervention, those guys also saw the reminder, so they not only got this jargon-free explanation of how to build their algorithm, but they also saw the text a few slides ago that basically says, don't forget to think carefully about this problem. Okay, let's get into our first main result. This is a graph of a mean squared error of the algorithms produced by the subjects in the experiment. And what you immediately see is that representative data, this is the people that got completely, a random sample from the population that they were predicting, are significantly better in a mean squared error sense. The reminder actually decreases mean squared error compared to doing nothing, and it's about half as good, at least in a mean squared error sense, as our representative data intervention. And then over here in the technical advice, we see actually a negative effect. In other words, it would have been better to just do the reminder or to have done nothing than to have done, than to offer this technical advice. So I'm sure this is going to raise a question about, did you offer the right technical advice? We can talk about this a little bit more at the end. But what we think is basically going on is implementation frictions, and we can talk a little bit more about that towards the end. Okay. Now, as we assess why representative data did so well, we also took measurements of how hard they were working and how long it took them. And the one I'll show you next is self-reported, but it's consistent with other measures we have. The representative data group worked, 31% more hours, which amounts to 5 additional hours over a period of 2 weeks, in which they had to complete this task. And so when we adjust our mean squared error results for how long they work on it, almost a full a third of the effect goes away just after taking into account how many hours worked on it. So this is an example of something that you don't see very often in computer science papers, but could be managerially relevant, which is that if if a company is willing to do the capital investment to get higher quality data, this will not only pay off in terms of the kind of obvious way, which, but also in terms of the complementaries. in terms of the fact that it's now worth spending more time with this data, but because the engineer thinks that they can squeeze more out of it if it's high quality. All right, so this, like I said, this points at the idea that effort and data are complements. But we had this subtreatment about the effect of incentives. Let me just tell you about this briefly. So everyone's incentive was to reduce mean squared error in the out-of-sample predictions that they were doing. This was based on an incentive contract that gave them a threshold and a slope. Now, within this context, the marginal benefit of an extra hour is going to be, related to the greater probability of passing the slope, or the opportunity of passing the threshold, sorry, or the opportunity to go higher on the slope. And so basically, the our hypothesis with this result around complements is that when you have good data, the marginal benefit of this extra unit of effort is higher. Right? So in our subtreatments, I mean, the same basic setup suggests that that the marginal benefit would also be higher if the slope is higher, or if the threshold is higher. And so we actually randomized both of these, and what we found was that the higher slopes and the higher thresholds actually do induce higher efforts and better performance. That would be lower mean squared error here. But that's disproportionately true in our better data treatments. Okay, so the effect of these stronger incentives showed up basically everywhere, but it was especially strong in our condition with better, where the engineers got better data. And this kind of suggests that it's not just effort and better data that are complements, but effort, data, and better incentives, that all work complementary, in a complementary way to decrease the bias in these algorithms. Okay, so now let me show you our results about discrimination. So, like I said earlier, what we mean by discrimination is the willingness of the programmer to actually change a prediction of someone's math skill based on a demographic variable like gender. Okay? And we assess this through this resume audit type approach, where we randomly manipulate the inputs of the audits to see how changing one variable at a time would affect the predictions that come out. Okay? Here are our main set of results. What we see is it was incredibly common for these researchers, for these AI engineers, to explicitly use gender or a gender proxy variable in the algorithms that they built. So we not only manipulated gender, but we also had manipulated other gender proxy variables. The most common and the variable that was most correlated with gender was what the person was doing in their previous job, people who were previously doing domestic work or taking care of children, or who were teachers. These were the gender proxy variables that we also manipulated here. So both of these were used by lots of our programmers, 60% overall for gender, and about 40% for the gender proxy variable. And in the right-hand column, or right-hand bar, in most cases, over 80%, it was the male observation that was higher. So if you looked at the same exact virtual resume and made it male or female, it would be the male version that these programmers' algorithms would score more highly. Okay? Now, we don't see huge differences across our treatment arms in the willingness to use these gender variables. But if anything, there is a slightly bigger effect in the representative data. Okay, so this is a downside of the representative data treatment, or offering the engineers, higher quality data. They're more likely to use sensitive variables And as we dug into this and looked at our survey results, what's going on is that the programmers who use representative data are not looking at the code book and reading variables line for line and saying, well, should that go in the algorithm or not? The representative data approach, consists of people, of the engineers kind of throwing the kitchen sink at the problem and letting some sort of unsupervised algorithm decide what variables should stay or go, and it's ending up, including using gender a lot of the time, or using a gender proxy variable a lot of the time. So that could be addressed with a policy intervention that we didn't do, but it does suggest this trade-off. In the the reminder and the technical advice, this was lower. The use of gender variables explicitly, and we think that because the reminder triggered them to think about this, and the technical advice did too, insofar as that it asked people to be careful about which variables actually went into their algorithm and how they should reweight observations to take this into account. All right, I want to make sure I have enough time, so let me skip to some things closer to the end. So let's now just look at prediction accuracy. My first set of results were overall mean squared error, that you can break down mean squared error into bias and variance. What we find is that the benefit for representative data, probably unsurprisingly, is almost entirely from the reduction of bias. Whereas the benefit from our reminder intervention for mean squared error ended up being a large part variance, actually not bias reduction. So it may look superficially that the reminder is performing really well, and all things being equal, you would rather have lower variance and lower MSE. But what this suggests is that the reminders really aren't as effective as they appear at reducing the gender bias that was the motivation for the study to begin with. We also saw two systematic patterns, I'm interested to hear people's reaction to this. If you look at two subjects with the same actual math performance, the male's predicted score is higher. So it looks like kind of men are getting the benefit on average from these algorithms. On the other hand, if you look at two subjects with the same predicted math performance, it's true that the male's actual score is higher, which in other contests suggests that they're actually the ones being discriminated with. But I think most people would think that the first measure is what most people in this field think of as constituting prediction bias. Now, nonetheless, there is overall a pattern of overestimation in our results. That is, almost all subjects are being overestimated in terms of their math ability. That's what that's what came out of the AI engineers programming efforts. Women were a little bit more overestimated on the whole than men, and that's potentially not surprising insofar as if we think of these math organizations that are employing the subjects in the OECD data as like having a low standard for men and a higher standard for women, then all the women who get through would have to be superstars, and then you would get this effect like we're seeing right here. But through another lens, it almost looks like the algorithmic bias is happening in the opposite direction insofar as it makes the female subjects in the OECD data, they end up being predicted as being better than they actually are. And men have some overestimation as well, but it's not as high as what we see for women. All right, now our last set of results. Actually, I'm supposed to leave 10 minutes, so I'll hurry through these. Basically, we find almost no relationship between the personal characteristics of a programmer and how their algorithm performed on almost any dimension. And the one kind of exception to this is that they're correlated prediction errors. So when we average a male programmer and a female programmer's predictions together, that average is more predictive than if you averaged 2 men or 2 women in isolation. That basically means that there's benefits coming from averaging across a diverse population, and that even if no one within this diverse population is better as a whole, that the average is better because of the uncorrelated errors. Okay, so that was the last result, and now I kind of I'll summarize in the talk. AI engineers are a really nice kind of study population for organizational personnel type of research. That's true for lots of reasons, but some of them are. They work on important problems with social and with business impact. That includes promoting news articles or making loan decisions. And they also have really nice measurement properties. You can measure their output compared to ground truth. You can manipulate their inputs through field experiments or through audit sort of studies like we did today. So just to kind of wrap this up, most of algorithmic fairness literature is from is in CS theory, but in the real world, code is not written according to theory very often, and it's written by employees that are kind of subject to pressures that aren't typically in CS theory. That includes kind of managerial oversight, incentives, training, and other variables that we've tried to assess here. So on to our, coming back to the motivating question, is it more like biased programmers or biased data? Both of these are, I think, important issues about representation, but at least in our study, it was the biased data that has a bigger effect for the outcomes that we measured. And this comes partly through an unexpected channel, which is the complementarities between data, effort, and incentives. And we do, of course, find some benefits for programmer diversity. This is particularly through the uncorrelated errors signal. And there are probably some other benefits that are outside the scope of our study and that follow-up work would be able to document better. But at least for what we can measure, these effects are not nearly as big as the effect of biased data. In any event, I'm sorry for going over. Let me see how we're doing. Okay, 5 minutes.
Not bad.
Sorry. Thank you so much.
Just a quick question, Bo.
Yeah, no problem.
So, to what extent can you say something about how, if at all, any of the results are driven by subpopulations inside the group of coders? So, like when you see a particular result, could it be driven by the higher quality coders, for instance, the ones where you give them technical advice, or but not generally true? I mean, you get an average result because the subpopulation is having a particular effect, is the question.
Most of our results, we have looked at different subpopulations, and I'll tell you what they are. When we look at these subpopulations, the precision of the estimates goes down, of course, but we do see the same basic general patterns. The ones that I guess I'll especially highlight is when we looked across different groups, across the different demographic groups. Of course, this was a topic of the actual motivating topic for the experiment as a whole. We also looked at differences between our boot camp subjects and our more experienced ones, and the general trends that we saw appeared in both the groups there. And we've sliced this in lots of different ways, but those are really the ones that we're typically asked about. If there are any other ones that you think are worth following up, it would definitely be great to know. We should do this too.
The questioner was asking about the higher quality coders versus the lower quality coders and so on. That was
so we
yeah.
Yeah. In terms of coder quality, we do have prior grades, at least, or the grades in the other part of the performance in the other parts of the boot camp for those. And the higher grade programmers in the boot camp do perform better on this task too. But when it comes to the heterogeneous effective treatments, the treatment effects all go in the same direction, for the relatively high quality and the relatively low quality
Yeah.
students.
So one final question is from Alex Miller.
Uh-huh.
Is your sample of AI programmers unrepresentative in some sense if the population of AI engineers is already self-selected in some way? You may not have sufficient variation for detecting the effects of true diversity. That's an interesting question. I suppose I would add to that I would think that you want those people as your set because those are the people you suspect are writing algorithms in companies like Google and Facebook. But I suppose there's also a point to the question, which is, should we be recruiting a more diverse set of people to be creating the algorithms in a more diverse set of teams rather than just coders running the algorithmic development at these companies?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a completely on point question, and there is some fundamental limit to what we can conclude from this sample. And because it is unrepresentative, it's actually slightly more diverse than the population as a whole of software engineers. But there still is, of course, lots of room for it to get much more diverse. I guess you should say, yeah, I mean, I don't really view this as necessary. We're not trying to say this is the final word on this topic or anything like this. And one of the things that I hope happens, coming out of this experiment is that people take a more empirical approach to the problem, generally speaking, and later on, maybe there'll be a different population where you could kind of measure heterogeneous effects along the lines that I think Alex is asking about.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate you, Bo. This is really interesting work and a very important topic. Very well done. It's great to have experimental studies about things like this, especially at a scale like this. So we appreciate it, and thanks very much.
So thank you so much. It was great, hearing your all's perspectives and having the chance to present the work.
Great.
Take care. Thank you again.
Yep. I just want to remind everyone for next week, or the next speaker, I should say, is Alan Davidson, who's the senior advisor at Mozilla. And he's going to be talking about Election 2020, a preview, implications for the digital economy. So we look forward to seeing you all at the next one.
Sounds awesome.
All right, everybody.
Thanks again.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinan. Bye-bye.
Bye.